Thank you very much for that. So I'd like to introduce our moderator, and we'd like to start the panel as soon as possible. So Christoph Walter is going to be our moderator for the panel, and he's an agribusiness and agricultural sustainability expert. He's the co-founder and consultancy director at Agromondis, a Nigerian-German agribusiness development and agri-finance consultancy, and looks back at a 20-year career working in the agricultural, extension, consumer goods, research, and consulting sectors. So Christoph Walter, over to you for this incredible panel session that I know it's going to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. And also thank you, Ms. Motola, for your introductory words. And we have a similarly eminent panel, which probably doesn't warrant much of an introduction. In fact, if any of the audience do need the bios, I can refer them to the website, which is just looking it up. It's conferences.businessday.ng/ANC, as in a national conversation, ANC 2020. So the speaker bios are on there. But I don't think actually any of our speakers today will need an introduction. I'm going to tell you who's here in a minute. The topic is on COVID-19 and food security. And we have on the panel Mr. Aliyu Abdul Hamid, the MD and CEO of Narsal. We have Ndidi Winili from Sahel Consulting, who's also a co-founder of various other businesses, including AACE Foods. And we have Boye Olusanya from Flour Mills of Nigeria, Kola Masha from Babangona. And we're expecting and waiting for Sunny Dangote, who has not yet joined, as it seems, but he's traveling and is on a different time zone, so we'll give him some time to find his way into the session. And we'll start in view of the slight delay that we've had, and we'll try to finish on time nonetheless. Ndidi, may I start with maybe asking you, as somebody who looks at the agri-business sector and the farming sector in Nigeria, probably with a slightly more holistic view than many of our other participants, to maybe give us a few words on what your view is in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on food, on the food and nutrition sector in Nigeria. Just a few highlights, maybe.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Business Day for organizing this conference and convening us today. As you mentioned, I wear many hats, and through my work over the last 12 years in this landscape, recognized that our ecosystem was already fragile before COVID-19 hit. And we already had challenges around productivity, infrastructure, post-harvest losses, etc. But what COVID-19 has done through the partial and full lockdowns, restrictions and movement, disruptions in supply chain and trade, as well as challenges transporting inputs to farmers and farmers transporting produce to markets, is that it's further weakened our ecosystem. This has been compounded with the rising unemployment due to labor losses and reduction in remittances and the decline in purchasing power. So across the country, we're seeing food price hikes, in some regions as low as 20%, in some regions as high as 100%. Gari, which is a staple in our country, has almost doubled in parts of southeastern Nigeria, and in parts of Lagos increased by 30 to 40%. Gari is just one indicator. And these are locally sourced foods. For imported foods, they've definitely increased in price. We've also seen a shortage of raw materials, which has affected processors, and some processors have had to shut down operations or reduce their operations, primarily because they can't get rice paddy or they can't get cassava roots. There's been a slight delay in the start of the planting season in parts of Nigeria, and we've also seen a greater interest in the utilization of technology for purchasing food by the middle and upper income households, increased price sensitivity by consumers and a down trading, and also a decline in the purchasing of nutritious food. But generally, we've seen a rising level of hunger, malnutrition, and social unrest in the country. A few key things to watch. Number one is that COVID-19 is presenting us with an opportunity to reimagine and rebuild our agricultural landscape, not only in terms of collaboration, and this is critical for the private sector and the public sector, to really think about how we collaborate to ensure that we can rebuild. First, ensuring we have credible data about our food markets, reimagining how our markets are structured to ensure social distancing, thinking through the policy frameworks and the fact that we need a cohesive approach to food. Food is not just for the Ministry of Agriculture, but trade and investment, science and technology, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Women Affairs. It really requires a multi-sectorial and cohesive approach. We need to strengthen our grain reserves, because what we've seen during this COVID-19 is that we've been challenged in terms of how to feed our people and to address the most vulnerable quickly. And finally, we really need to think about how we strengthen our SMEs. SMEs are the bedrock and the heart of innovation and the food ecosystem globally and in Nigeria. And many of them have been hit by the brunt of this COVID-19, and we need to rebuild through catalytic financing, capacity building, and support. I believe COVID-19 presents us with a wonderful opportunity to reimagine, retool, and rebuild. It's painful, but we have to create an ecosystem that's strong, and Nigeria has to commit to feeding itself and feeding the rest of Africa. I think if we collaborate, if we invest, and we think systematically about how to address this, we can achieve measurable impact.
Didi, thank you very much. I think that was very, very comprehensive, touching on macro and microeconomics, farming, food processing, policy. So you've given us a great backdrop for this conversation there. Thank you very much. I see that it looks like Sunny Dangote has come online. Yes, there you are, sir. You just probably missed the initial words from Didi here, outlining the impact of COVID-19 on food systems and food security. And in an earlier conversation that we had, you were quite outspoken on the need for a national food security strategy, or a strategy on national food security. And I think Ndidi confirmed that she said this crisis has accentuated some of the underlying structural issues that the sector has been grappling with before. So there is an opportunity to rebuild, reimagine, to redesign. And if I may ask you, Sunny Dangote, to briefly explore in a few words how such a national food security strategy could actually look in practice, and what's required.
Well, I'm very sorry, first of all, for confusing the timing. My apologies for joining quite late. But anyway, well, in a nutshell, what I would say is that the issue of food security, and this is a fact of reality which we have even come to realize with this pandemic issue, that it is a problem that we have not squarely faced in Nigeria to tackle the problem. From my understanding and from the best of my understanding of the situation on the ground, we had never been serious really to face the issue of our food security. Like I said, we are 200 million people. And when we look at food security, we are not only talking about what generally we consume, but what do we have in case of any crisis.
And when you say getting serious about this issue, what are the building blocks? What are the ingredients? Who are the actors that need to come together, maybe, in as a very first step from your view to build such a strategy?
If you look at the total aggregate value supply chain, and then you look at the primary producers, you look at the input suppliers, you look at the strategy for the country to look at what are the main grains and what are the other food items that needs to be strategically worked on to ensure there will be continuous production and sustainable production in terms of need versus demand and supply, and also in terms of reserve that will be able to keep the country in in terms of crisis or shortages or so on, that will be able to sustain, and also at a good affordable price across the whole status quo of the country in terms of the low-level income earners and the medium and the high income earners. So we look at it generally. If you look at the whole cry about the rice production, there's no statistics to show how much we produced last year, previous years, or even coming next year. What's our plan? And what do we expect the production to be? And from which sector to which sector, which part of the country and which state? And also, if you look at the reserve, what do we have as a reserve in any of the main grains, especially in the rice that is the most stable, crop? There's no any reserve in terms of such, issue. It's what comes and what goes. And there's no any proper statistic to show the small farm holders that we are working with through different assistance programs with the central bank. What is the plan there? We know that central bank has made some funds available, which they give to small farmer holders to access, and then it is not so coordinated between all the ministries. If you look at the Ministry of Agriculture, what are they planning for the next year or for this year? If you look at water resources, what are they planning for the use of the reservoirs and the dams and so on? If you look at Ministry of Agriculture, it's completely disconnected with the Ministry of Water Resources. You look at the central bank, it's doing all within its own resources to ensure that they provide funds, but funds is not the only solution. There's supposed to be a cohesive and joint efforts that everybody works together with the private sector, with the public sector, with all the stakeholders to be able to have a national plan of saying this is the approach to agriculture. We look at the research institutions. What are we doing about the inputs? We look at the fertilizers. A lot of the local farmers are rejecting some of these fertilizers that are imposed upon them. And then there's no any variety that you can say, depending on which crop you want to do. What is the soil analysis? The last few years, the federal government did a sampling of the soil, but every area to another area, it may vary. Even from one season to another season, your soil needs may vary. So you have one standard or two standard fertilizer mix, which is supplied to all the farmers. So these are the issues. Also, you look at the irrigation scheme. We have over 230 something dams in the country. How many of them are utilized for the agricultural purpose? Most of them are not used for irrigation. The few ones that are used, less than 10%, are farmers on their own drawing the lines and using the water on their own, not because it is fully organized. The only ones that are organized, the few ones that I know, were the ones that have been done since in the 70s. Now, up to today, if you go to Kano or you go to Sokoto, some of those dams that are fully, some of them utilized, they are not well coordinated and planned, because sometimes, like even this year and the last year, they disrupted the farmers' planting season because they wanted to do repairs on canals at the mid of the dry season. So everybody lost the crop last year and this year. So this is the same thing now. They stopped now the work during the pandemic, and they're proposing next year they're going to do it. So, and then you can come and claim what? There's nothing. So what we are proposed under Nigeria Agribusiness Group is that, look, we from Nigeria Agribusiness Group, which is an association for all the farmer group association, is to work with the Federal Ministry of Agriculture, Central Bank, Ministry of Water Resources, and then Ministry of Women Affairs and so on, and come up with a national planning and come up with a strategic plan whereby there will be a reserve situation, grain reserve system, there will be a guaranteed price mechanism, there will be a development for irrigation scheme, there will be a development for input suppliers and research institutions to work together and come up with the
So if I might interrupt you here briefly, so there's a very clear need for coordination that you're outlining between the different ministries, between the ministries and the Central Bank of Nigeria, between research institutes, which absolutely rings true. I think if we look at the developments of the last years, I'd quickly like to ask Boy Olusanya, who also spoke to me about some of the issues they're facing earlier. This is also in the grains sector, mostly. Boy, you also talked about land and land title and land reform. And I was just wondering whether you could expand a little bit on that, how you experience the issues from a supply chain, a buyer side. What are the problems there?
Thanks, Christoph. And actually, I will just add a bit more before onto what Alhaji Sani just reiterated. We're talking, I mean, if we come to land, it comes under the same thing, which is a need for a structured and developed ecosystem that supports the entire agri value chain. And part of that structured ecosystem is of course land. But I'll just reiterate once again that one thing that we need to note that has happened in the country in the last few years, and that's an outcome of the lack of structure and the processes. There's been an increase in area under cultivation from a pure agri point of view, but a decrease in yield, which means we're actually putting a lot of farmers, a lot of people to farm, but making them poorer, which is the biggest disincentive you can have for anyone to go into farming, and that needs to be fixed. And that's a lot of what Alhaji Sani was referring to. Now, part of that process is also the need, when you're talking about, we've got this drive and this passion to try and replicate some of the success of what happened with Southeast Asia economies, which is fair enough. And when we're taking them, we need to take into consideration what is relevant in this part of the world. Part of that growth or drive in those economies was the realization that initially, or in the initial phase of development, they needed to get employment through agri, and that included the need to drive smallholder farmer. I mean, ultimately, farming, for it to be really viable, needs to be on a commercially scaled basis. But where we are today, our first step needs to be a support for smallholder farmers. But smallholder farming on its own, without an incentive for the farmer to be in it for the long term, to invest not just for this year's harvest, but to plan for next year's harvest, needs him to have a sense of ownership and a sense of belonging or a sense of title to the land. What we've got more and more in Nigeria is we've moved to a point where we've got community land or federal land, and community land doesn't really work, because what you end up with is a community in which there are disparate people who want disparate things from the land, as opposed to a group of people who really want to farm. Now, one of the people we'll be talking to, Kola, is into a kind of scheme where you're getting to create cooperatives that are an amalgam of farmers or people who want to farm. And those kind of structures should be encouraged by them being given access to leaseholds on land for a period of time that allows them to develop and stay in farming for the long term. Now, we're trying to balance two things. We're trying to balance the sense of ownership. That means farmers are not just farming for one harvest, but are farming for a longer period of time and are coming together in a club that allows them to do bigger investments, whilst we also don't want to end up in a situation where farmland becomes just a land for sale exercise. But until you get that sense of ownership and belonging for farmers, then it becomes very difficult, where they're basically scrambling for day-to-day existence. Decisions on which crops to plant become immediate and not necessarily economic. And there's no long-term viability in the process that they're running. That needs to be fixed, but it comes back to a structured and well-developed ecosystem that deals with that.
Good boy, that's a very, very useful addition. So I'm having an echo here. Can people hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, then that's only my echo. Very useful, thank you, Boy. So before I forget this entirely, to the audience, there is an opportunity to ask the speakers questions, and we'll probably have time to pass a few questions on to them, which you can do, as in other sessions, via the Slido app. So you can download on your phone an app called Slido, S-L-I-D-O, and then use the hashtag B, D for Business Day, and then lowercase ANC, as in a national conversation, 2020. So hashtag BDANC 2020, and you can post your questions there and they will be collected. We can pass them on in the Q&A session at the end. Boy, taking over from what you just said about farmers' incentives for creating incentives for farmers to actually farm profitably. I think very few organizations and companies have been so successful in doing that at scale with smallholder farmers as Babangona. So I would like to briefly pass the word to Kola Masha to talk a little bit about how such a functioning ecosystem could look in practice, because I think Babangona have actually created such an ecosystem for many of their member farmers. And Kola, if you could expand a little bit about that in the context of maybe a Nigerian strategy for food security, what can be learned?
Well, thank you, Christoph. And I think, fundamentally, what we've tried to do with Babangona over the last 9 years is to build a system that at scale integrates many of the points that our previous speakers, Boye Sani, spoke to. I think at the end of the day, what we've done at Babangona is, today we're, Nigeria's single largest maize producing entity and on track to be actually Africa's largest single maize producing entity, farming over 75,000 acres of maize. I think to put that in context, that's about equivalent to 5 Manhattans. And I think at the end of the day, we have developed a model that enables smallholder farmers to not only, to first and foremost, access the capital they need to invest in quality inputs to dramatically increase their yield. Now, the average Babangona member attains yields at about 2x national average, so that's equivalent yields to, say, China, Brazil, so on and so forth today. They're able to attain net incomes at about 2.5 times the national average. And we're able to demonstrate that this can be done in a financially sustainable way and ensure that we can get repayment rates from the loans we provide to farmers that is north of 98%. Now, the reality is that we are not, many countries have actually already replicated and scaled models similar to Babangona at a national scale. And I think the best example of this, I would say, would be Thailand. If you go back to 1980, Thailand and Nigeria had the same per capita GDP. Today, Thailand has a per capita GDP that's 4 times Nigeria and has one of the lowest unemployment rates on the planet, about 0.7% unemployment rate. Just think about that, right? Nigeria is on track to have unemployment rate that is north of 25%. They have 0.7% unemployment rate. Now, how did Thailand do that? Well, beginning in the early 80s, they were able to scale and replicate models similar to Babangona that dramatically improved the productivity and profitability of their farmers. Then layering upon that, they actually strategically devalued their currency to enable their farmers to be very competitive on the global market, so they could start to export significant volumes of commodities. And then once they're able to dominate the export of raw commodities, then they started to attract foreign investment, particularly from Japan, to start to forward integrate into higher value agro-processing. As they built up really one of the world's largest agro-processing industries, they were able to continue to evolve into even higher value manufacturing, to the point that today Thailand produces 3 million cars a year, more than the United Kingdom. So we feel fundamentally, I think that is kind of the journey that Nigeria needs to follow. And I think it's important that we recognize that it is a journey, and we take it step by step. And then over probably a period of 15 to 20 years, we can see dramatic transformation.
Thank you, Kola. That was very strategic, which is great. And I think the view to other nations who've accomplished what Nigeria is trying to accomplish in the past is a very useful one. Thailand is a great example. Probably Vietnam is also a good example of being slightly behind Thailand probably, but nonetheless having gone a similar path. Now, all of this, and Babangona is of course also a financing organization, but all of this needs to be financed. Farmers need to be financed, and investment needs to be supported into the agri-processing and agribusiness sector. Aliyu Abdul Hamid, may I ask you, as the MD of Narsal, to say a few words about Narsal's journey itself, because it has also adjusted strategy over the, I think, 4 years of its existence now, a couple of times to adjust to the realities of what works and what doesn't work, and to incorporate learning. And today is a very different beast from what it was when it was born, but probably one that is more successful and effective. Could you say a few words about how this can be financed? And you will have to unmute yourself. You're still on mute.
Yeah. Can you hear me all?
We can. Thank you.
All right, great. Christoph, thank you very much. Welcome, colleagues. Virtually everyone on this panel. Well, it's a small village, and Didi, Boy, and Sani. It's a pleasure that we are meeting virtually. And I would like to start off by finding a hybrid position between what Boy has said and what Kola just finished off on. And I love that Thailand model, because whatever we have, if we can be able to get a national template that has been successful, leveraging our own reality, it could be the Thailand model. With that said, let me tell you a bit about this organization. And Christoph, thanks for really tracing a bit of our history. We're just about 4.5 years old post-exit from the central bank. We have been a small project implementation office in the central bank. And with my appointment in 2016, we came out and we had to hit the ground running. There was no systems, no processes, no offices, no staff. And we had contingent liability in the market. So we had to maintain our relationship reputation, issuing guarantees, doing risk management while building the organization. So a lot of multitasking had to be done. But we're happy to say, after 4 years, we have been able to finish the establishment phase. We're in all the 774 local governments, 37 states in Nigeria, and with headquarters building and everything. And we are glad to say we are ready now to go exponential in terms of learning models that have worked and taking them to scale, in terms of seeing what the market wants, what are the risk issues from the point of view of finance and investment, and integrating all of them into a holistic model that can make sense to everyone. Now, to do a deep dive into the issues at stake, I think sub-Saharan agriculture, probably with the exception of some developed agricultural models in SADC countries, South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe some time back, and probably some advanced agricultural models in Egypt. If you talk of the majority of Africa, you're talking sub-Saharan Africa, West, Central, and parts of Southern. We have to live with the reality of squaring the cycle of doing advanced agriculture of the 21st century, but incorporating the smallholders. It's not an either or. We would have to work with the reality of the smallholder, with his nature, with his social issues, but yet kind of upgrade him straight into the 21st century. Why do we have to do that? Because in Nigeria, as a sample, 60 to 70% of the labor force are involved in agri. According to IFAD, the smallholder farmer accounts for 80% of the farming population. You could see the way it's cascading. We have a population growth rate of 2.6% per annum. Yet, agri is only growing at 1% between 2014 to 2018. You can see the mismatch there. Now, with 200 million people to feed morning, noon, and night, the reality of the COVID new normal we're going to enter is that nobody will help us out. Even if you have all the dollars in the world, you go to India or Vietnam to import the rice, they will say, no, thank you. For their own national security needs, they would not need your money. They want to keep that food. And I remember, I think it was, I don't know who was speaking about whether we even have any grain reserve. Other countries are keeping what they have. So you are not even in an opportunity to import. Nobody will sell food to you at scale. And in any case, even if you have, where are the dollars? Oil price has tanked to something around $30 if it stays that way. So the reality is there. There is a double whammy effect on all of us here. So we have got to think out of the box. Now, what is the role of finance in food security? According to the National Bureau of Statistics, with all the efforts we have been making, still bank lending to agriculture accounts of only 4.4% of total bank lending as at Q4 2019. Now, how do you square this cycle? You have 80% of your population involved in agri, 23% of contribution to GDP, yet out of 100%, total bank lending is just sub 4.5%. That has to move. The other thing we need to take note of course, is the effect of the COVID-19 crisis. There is so much what do I say, like every other government in the world, government is doing what they can, largely in a knee-jerk reaction format, but they have to do what they have to do because nobody predicted there would be COVID. So essentially responses around the world, including advanced economies, including the US, is really every day with new strategy. We just go along until probably vaccines have been found or some other long-term solution. But this is the reality, and then that is not an exception for Nigeria. So what is our thinking? NASAL, as a $500 million organization wholly owned by the Central Bank of Nigeria, we are quite enabled in terms of our capital and by extension the capital of the central bank to be able to provide three things to the Nigerian agricultural economy, especially now that we are fully established. We sit in the nexus of risk management, agricultural finance, and agricultural development. We have got to draw expertise from all these three sectors in order to create a sustainable agricultural economy that is inclusive of 80% of Nigeria's population. We cannot afford to have a corporate agriculture model in Nigeria. That would be a social disaster. The thinking is that the smallholder must be included willy-nilly. Now, that is where models like Babangonas and others are very critical. And if we know what we are doing, such models must be very critically studied and huge finance must come in to take them to scale because it takes a village to lift us out of this economic doldrum, especially in agriculture. It is not Babangona alone, it's not NASAL alone, it's not CBN alone. We have to have 1, 2, or 3 models that have seemed to have worked in Nigeria and other comparator countries, and we adopt them at scale. One of those models is what NASAL is trying to do.
Could I just ask, Ali, could I just ask, you said huge finance needs to come in. Is the funding that NASAL has at its disposal going to be enough to manage this, or can you give us a sense of scale when you say a lot of finance?
So NASAL's funds are not designed to be given out.
It's a risk management facility, yes, of course. Yeah.
To create partial risk guarantees to investors, financiers, to support models like Babangonas to go to scale. Yeah. Our job is to issue guarantees on the back of our capital, and by extension, of course, CBN's balance sheet is also part of it, being 100% on. So we don't give out loans, but we give out partial risk guarantees specifically for agriculture. We do technical assistance to ensure that any opportunity we see is de-risked, because the first thing you have to de-risk before you attract finance. And we ensure that the market logic plays right along the value chain through an integrated format. The upstream, midstream, and downstream must be so totally integrated horizontally and vertically that you don't see leakages of finance flows in the system. Because at the end of the day, the key thing is to give comfort to the owners of 4 capitals: finance capital, equipment capital, technology capital, and the brain capital to design a project, execute a project, deliver a project that is sustainable, that can pay for itself, and post a profit for all actors. So those things are the universe in which NASAL operates, by de-risking, by creating new development models for agriculture, and also by enabling financing at the end to come. So what did we do? We said, look, can we go at scale? So you want to make a comment, Walter?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask there. You mentioned the supply chain. You mentioned the sort of seamless flow of finance and value and goods along the value chain. I was just going to ask Boye briefly about the experience in the Corona crisis specifically. A lot of people have said the biggest impact was actually on transport and distributing food, and it was not yet, at least, so much in production. And I was just going to ask Boye to briefly say something on that question. I mean, where were the bottlenecks in the Corona crisis?
Thanks, Christoph. Actually, bottlenecks were across, but I must comment here in particular the government and the Nigerian Governors Forum, who stepped in to ensure that there was, for food and agri companies, the exemptions were given for movement of goods and personnel. But the bottlenecks were twofold. The first one was once we were in lockdown phase, there was a huge difficulty in actually getting staff to work. So that in itself created a bottleneck. It meant we had to also invest in transport services in certain localities to ensure that we could move staff around, or actually invested in housing people in locales close enough to to farms and factories to ensure that the people were available to work. So that was the first real bottleneck that had to be dealt with, and that was how that was managed. The second one, in terms of movement of goods across, there were initial challenges, but as I also highlighted, there had been good communication, particularly between government and also on the producer side, where there were rules that allowed us to move goods and services, and that has eased a bit. The other part of it, though, which is part of what they did mention at the start, is you also have supply chain from outside, which has been hampered by a lot of what has happened in COVID. And that is particular in agriculture now, because you've got an issue with fertilizer coming into the country, which is a big input, particularly as the rainy season has just started. And that there's been a significant delay on that side, likely because of what has happened to COVID. And that is something we need to all have to manage to ensure that we don't actually miss the planting season that's coming up. But all in all, it was difficult, challenging, but support from government, support from various industries where staff were looked after has helped to ease that pain.
Great, thank you, Roy. And Ali, you already said, all governments globally are basically adjusting, shifting, looking what's happening. So there's obviously no recipe for this. And I think we earlier said there is probably learnings on how to strengthen some of the structural vulnerabilities and structural issues in the sector. A lot of knowledge actually on this already. I would like to do two things at this stage. Again, please, to the participants on the Slido app, there is also a poll. And this poll asks 3 questions that we would like to show at the end of this session, realizing that we're not particularly delving into the COVID-related issues here because they are very clear. Agrimondes has just published a report on COVID-19 and its impact on the Nigerian food security. I'm sure Sahel Capital has worked in the same area. So our report is available on our website, agrimondes.com, under publications. And I think all of these pieces of research come to very similar conclusions, which are that the crisis has accentuated issues and has brought issues to the fore, as previously have been mentioned. Sandy Dangote, I think, mentioned the lack of reserves, for example, which is something that is needs to be looked at in this context again. And Didi mentioned the lack of statistics and reliable data on farming, as well as Sani did. Land titling and the sense of ownership is certainly an issue, and coordination between the various actors, government and private, is also important. So these are all things that need to happen at a policy and government level. Ndidi also mentioned there is an opportunity here, and I would like to briefly maybe pass, before we go into audience questions, the word to her to say a couple of sentences only on how can Nigeria best turn this crisis into an opportunity, what actually needs to be done in very practical terms to ensure that we are emerging from this crisis strengthened, not weakened.
Thank you, Walter. I love the examples that have been shared. And one of the reasons why Babangona has been so successful is because of its relationship with off-takers and large multinationals. Farmers need to be guaranteed offtake. So I would like to propose what Brazil did, which is requiring 30% local sourcing. I would even say that in Nigeria, we should put a policy around 50 to 60% local sourcing for every single food processor, retailer, restaurant, hotel, because we need shorter value chains. We need our farmers to be guaranteed offtake to enable them invest. We need financiers like NISOL to be convinced that this funding will make sense. And that policy around homegrown solutions and sourcing locally will lead to innovation and would definitely foster a lot more interest and development across the value chain. We need a local processing sector that works. We need to displace imports. And so for me, I would say 50% local sourcing policy as a key take away from this COVID-19 strategy, which means the Ministry of Trade and Investment, Ministry of Finance, CBN, and Ministry of Ag have to really look at this and think through how it will work. That's just one recommendation. There are many
If I may
others around
interject
the use
there,
of
Didi.
technology and innovation to leapfrog, but I'll leave, yeah? Sorry,
Sorry,
go ahead.
to briefly interject, it's quite interesting that you emphasize local sourcing. I couldn't agree more. Having worked with a lot of the international food companies that, among others, Motola at Upfield is selling and representing, many of these companies, foreign companies, actually have very strong local sourcing policies, and they're usually 80% upwards. So it's interesting that actually
the last time I checked, they were actually importing a lot of their, Blue Band was almost exclusively importing its palm oil, sorry to say. So we would like them to source more local.
It's not. I'm not saying that they have achieved that. I'm just saying they have very strong internal policy drivers. I think that's an important distinction you're making there, though, indeed. But if you look at the brewery companies, for example, or many of the the Unilever products other than Blue Band, they aim to source locally. I think in looking at timing here, we would like to allow a couple of audience questions, and I'm just seeing a couple coming in here on my chat. Let me please double check that we're also capturing relevant ones. Christian, can you, I've got my colleague here on the line in the background. Christian, can you maybe give us an audience question that hasn't been addressed yet?
Okay, yes. One of the key questions was how Nigeria would be able to improve the agricultural value chain to change the narrative from being net importer of food to net exporter.
Okay, great. Is that question addressed to anyone else? Maybe Sunny Demoto is a good person to say a few words on this.
Can I make a comment on that?
Please, Aliyu. Yeah, Sunny, is that okay? We'll give you the word after that.
Okay. Sorry. No, sorry, Sunny was asked to comment. Sorry, so Sunny, you could go ahead.
All right. Well, like I said, to address this challenge, we need to come together holistically into one room with the government and private sector, with all the efforts of NASA, Central Bank providing some kind of funding. We need also the ministries, and we need also the association of all the agri organizations, which is under Nigerian Agribusiness Group, to sit down and fashion out a strategic plan that the resources from wherever can be channeled through a strategic target to be able to achieve a well-defined plan. We have all the resources. I hear so much about example of Brazil, Thailand. What is wrong with all our expertise, with all the professors, with all the research institutions, with all the experienced personnel we have in the agri-value chain? We have everybody there, really. The only problem is that we are so fragmented. We are all on a silo operational system where everybody is working on its own to achieve certain ideas, which at the end of the day, we are not getting a collective drive. So the most important is what I believe that with this pandemic issue has highlighted, that we need to go back to the basics. We have been talking about this coordinated approach, and we almost got there, but the last minister did not see it fit to go along with our ideas, to bring everybody on board and sit down at one session and agree on the process and the strategy of achieving all this. We hear about the local companies or multinational companies to use the local content and so on. If we sit down on that table, everybody will see the reality on the ground and will be able to passion out whether it is 90%, whether it is 100%, whether 80%, we will all come to agree, and we will agree gradually how do we step it up. And we agree this is the reserve. We have so many grain reserve, silos all over the country. What are they doing now? They are all lying down fallow. Nobody is utilizing them. At one time, they wanted to sell them off or privatize them off. We need to sit down with all the stakeholders and come up. We hear about the challenge of logistics. The problem of logistics is the cost of vehicle is so high today. Private companies cannot afford these days, not everybody can afford one truck with over 20 million naira cost. Then maintenance and so on. And how much is the freight from Lagos to Kano or Kano to Maiduguri or Enugu? The cost is so, no economic sense to afford such a value. So the need is there now, with awareness of what we've seen, the reality on the ground, to bring everybody together. And we, under Nigerian Agribusiness Group, we are proposing now to send a letter to all the ministries or all the government agencies and all the private organizations that are there to convey this very first and most important thing, that is to meet together and discuss this challenge and be able to passion out, so that we'll be able to tell ourselves what are the things we are going to face next season, dry season or rainy season, what is the strategic reserve. And we don't need always government to provide the money. The private sector, once they see it is going to be a reliable and sustainable approach, will be able to put in their money, bring investment, and it's a big opportunity. When we talk about the capital of NASL, $500 million, how can it play in the area where you're talking about trillion of naira in terms of the value and in terms of funding requirements? They are doing a good job, but we need to scale it up. Maybe by the time the NASL sees the opportunity, they can even increase their capital base to $2 billion, $10 billion. So the need is there. Maybe Central Bank will see that the need of over 3 trillion funding that is required. Where is the Bank of Agriculture? It has been made of no value much, except when they are needed, they are brought into the scheme. We need a development bank that understands the need. It's lack of the development agricultural bank that brought about NASL and so on. Now NASL has its
I'm hearing a strong.
We need to agree on this.
Yeah, I'm certainly hearing a strong word here for coordination, for defining very clearly the role of government and what government can best do and what the private sector can best do. And I think that's very encouraging to hear that as well. But of course, there is a big role for the private sector, and economic development is not necessarily what the government needs to do, but it needs to facilitate. And
yes.
In that sense, maybe quickly, Aliyu, do you want to add a couple of words to that as a representative of the government, if I may call you that?
Yeah, thank you, Walter. Let me take off where Sari just left off. He actually approached it from the macro, big scale perspective. Coordination is absolutely necessary. Everyone is siloized in this business. But let me start from the micro, granular, farmer level. The one thing that is clear is that those 80% of our population that are involved in farming, they must be structured, organized, and have governance at the field level. Otherwise, they cannot be doing every farmer doing his own thing on no more than 4 hectares, growing cocoyam here, groundnuts here, and everything under the same soil science, under the same microclimate, servicing the same community. There must be a way where farmers can come together to form what we NASL are driving at, called the geo-cooperative model. You form cooperative not on the basis of human affinity or we're friends. We form cooperatives because my plot of land and your parcel of land, we are neighbors in the same area. If we can be able to have a scale model of, let's say, a block of 50 hectares multiplied by 5, giving a geo-cooperative unit of 250 hectares, our economic model shows that when you have a 250-hectare lot, under the same governance, a president, a vice president, director of finance, with all the farmers following that leadership, from the perspective of risk management, this is the kind of model we can work with. Instead of creating a loan of 200,000 naira for a remote farmer in God knows where, and from the moment you open your vault, that money is gone, you are at least dealing with a ticket size of at least 65 million naira at the minimum. And you know who you're dealing with, and you have a geotagging using the latest technology in GIS and satellite. You can geotag every piece of land. You can tag the farmer. You can map the farmer to his land. You can map the leadership. So, for example, Bio, when he says, for example, in 2020, he can say, NASL, we need like 200,000 metric tons of white maize. What we can do based on the data we have, we would have known which part of the country best produces maize, yellow maize or white maize. How many number of geo-cooperatives are needed? How many hectares are needed? Who are the governance structures? And how much money is needed? Because right now, I have my offtake for 2021 from flour mills, I think, for that quantity of maize, for that quality and that delivery schedule. From the perspective of finance, if I can have that guaranteed, then it's easy for me to deal with sizable models and ticket sizes. So what we are doing right now is to try to structure such cooperatives, about 16,000 of them, targeting about 8 million farmers working on 4 million hectares. Our target is to see, can we be able to produce on this size about 12 million metric tons of grain product equivalent? And if you take an average price of grain, for example, at 100,000 per metric tons, we hope to see whether this value of grain can be up to 1.2 trillion naira contributed annually. But from the point of view of risk management, Walter and everyone here knows, to go to scale, you have got to provide competitiveness at the grassroots level, governance at the grassroots level, and supply chain security for inputs going to farming, that is the upstream, then from the upstream to the midstream, from the midstream to the downstream. All of them along those 4 categories must be financed, must be risk management, and there should be near zero cash movement among them. As long as we are serving structured industrial markets, export markets, or structured commodity markets. If you can have that virtual ecosystem, then working with the Chinese model, it takes a village to make this work. Even if we have this model, it takes the Ministry of Finance, it takes the platform for NABG as the convener, it takes the Ministry of Trade and Investment, it takes all the research ends to say, okay, guys, what do you need to make this work? But those 80% of Nigeria's population, who are the farmers, cannot be able to be competitive as long as they're disorganized, structured, and governed, and everyone is doing something. And that is what we're embarking on for the next 4 years.
Thank you. And that's exciting because I think it gives the more general blueprint to what Babangona are exemplifying. And I think Kola unfortunately had to drop off the call. We're also running out of time. Oh, you're still there, Kola. Hello. Sorry, you shifted position on my screen here with your image. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We also have lots of more additional questions from the audience, which unfortunately we could not address. I think this was an excellent panel with lots more to offer. And if only we could carry on with this conversation, I think we'll have our national food security strategy within a couple of hours together between us. So maybe there is an action for Business Day to provide a platform for following up on this. And if not then I think we can take it in our own hands. With this, I would like to thank all of the speakers and sorry for the limited amount of time that was there. I think this obviously is a much bigger topic which needs deeper exploration. But we were able to tease out a lot of the critical ingredients here. And with that, I would like to pass back to Lele to wrap us up and I think also disclose the poll results. Lele, you're still on mute.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for that very wonderful panel session. I think it's critical to note that what is obviously lacking is a systemic and integrated proposition for agribusiness and the agricultural value chain. Government agencies and ministries involved in the agribusiness and value chain should be well linked and work together, hand in hand with the private sector, participants, large, medium, and small scale players. We obviously still have issues such as power and infrastructure issues that are prohibiting the agricultural value chain to enhance. And essentially, the government needs to create an enabling environment to encourage private investment in agriculture. We need to find a way for small-scale farmers to actually scale, and that can only be achieved through mechanization. So I'd like to go through some of the polls that were given today. So one of the questions that was asked to our audience is, has enough been done to prevent agriculture from the effects of COVID-19? And unsurprisingly, 92% of our audience said no. The second question was, getting food supplies has been more difficult. Has getting food supplies been more difficult under the lockdown? And 72% of our audience said yes. And lastly, do you agree that there is a risk of food shortage in Nigeria? And interestingly enough, 100% of our audience yes. Christoph, thank you so much for that wonderful panel session. I'd like to also thank our esteemed panelists for being with us. And as he mentioned, we'd like to continue this conversation offline. So please do follow us on social media and on our YouTube channels. So thank you very much, everybody. And Christoph, thank you for being such a wonderful moderator.
Thank you, Liz.